So now that we got the biggest surprises out of the way, let's get into the movies that I was disappointed in. So these were the movies that I remember going into it thinking that because the trailers looked really good, or the talent involved was really good, or the franchise itself was really good, I was expecting these movies to be really something else, really something that I would just look at the end of the year as like, wow, I'm really glad I saw them. And unfortunately, these are not those movies. So let's get into some honorable mentions. First up, Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Honestly, only because I gave this the exact same rating I gave the first Sonic the Hedgehog movie, that's the only reason it's an honorable mention. Even though I did like Sonic and Tails in the movie, and I did like Knuckles in the movie, and I did like the last 30 minutes where he does turn into, Super Sonic at the end, I honestly just felt like the movie was way too long. I didn't like that fact that James Marsden was separated from a lot of the action, and just felt the pacing of the movie. It was just not as good as it's weirdly because it's better than the first movie and not better than the first movie at the same time. It's about as good as the first movie in my opinion. Empire of Light. I didn't even review this movie. I was looking forward to it because Sam Mendes directed it, and honestly, even though Olivia Colman's performance is really good, I just felt the movie itself was just kind of been there, done that. The whole arc with Michael Ward's character is just not interesting, and I felt like a lot of things that happened to him in this movie were unfortunately for shock value rather than just simply. It just didn't work for me, unfortunately. Blonde, Ana de Armas is a really great actress, and she makes this movie worth watching. But that's 3 hours of watching Marilyn Monroe just suffer, and Marilyn Monroe deserves better than that. Halloween Ends. The only reason why this movie is on this list is because even though I wasn't really looking forward to this movie, the actual ideas of this movie are really good. The problem is it's stuck in a Halloween movie. And I feel like you could have explored this in another movie, just as long as you don't try to shoehorn the climax of this whole thing between Michael Myers and Laurie Strode. And it just felt like that whole thing was like the last 10 minutes of the movie. It didn't work for me, and I feel like it could have worked better if it wasn't here. Speaking of which, Jurassic World Dominion's in the same camp. The whole idea is very interesting, it's very unique, and I kind of would like to see this type of thing explored in another movie. Problem is, it's a Jurassic Park movie, and I'm not gonna lie, I'm not really a big fan of the Jurassic Park franchise. Love the first movie. Haven't really liked anything else. And this movie may be the worst of them all. Even though there are some great moments, particularly with the original trio, I'm just thinking, why'd you bring them back for this? And even though Bryce Dallas Howard is admittedly good in this movie, I didn't like Chris Pratt in this movie. I didn't think he was really good. I just felt like it kind of just didn't know where it wanted to go. It just kind of just did all these things. It kind of retconned some things from Fallen Kingdom. And the whole thing where at the end of Fallen Kingdom, how all those dinosaurs were released. Yeah, barely mentioned in this movie. It's 2.5 hours. And this is how you end it. It was just a train wreck. It's a franchise that should have gone extinct a long time ago. And lastly, Lightyear. This was a movie that, admittedly, I kind of just didn't know what it was going to be going into it, but it had to be at least good. Pixar's involved. It's a Toy Story movie, kind of. Unfortunately, I just didn't really care for a lot of it, even though the animation is pretty solid, and Chris Evans does a really good job as Buzz Lightyear. Also, Uzo Aduba as his partner in the movie, and Keke Palmer as his new partner in the movie. They both did a really good job. I honestly didn't care for a whole lot else. I didn't care for... The twist is interesting, but it's definitely a controversial twist. I didn't really care for some of the side characters, like the one played by Taika Waititi, who I'm going to bring up again in this video. Didn't really like him. And I also kind of don't really like the message of the movie. Even in bad Pixar movies, the message is usually really good. Like, oh, I didn't love Onward, but the message was nice. I didn't love Brave, but the message was nice. Here, I didn't even like the message. Basically, the message I got from this movie is that if you screw up and you just don't wind up where you want to be, just stay there. That is a horrible lesson. That is a really awful lesson to teach kids. That is a really horrible lesson to teach anybody. And I didn't like Lightyear, and I'm just kind of... I didn't love Toy Story 4 personally, but I'm just kind of over the Toy Story franchise now. This is the direction it's going to go into. Also, I kind of didn't like the whole, this is based off a movie that Andy saw as a kid, and I'm like, No kid would watch this movie. No child would watch this movie and call it their favorite movie. That annoyed me a lot. For a lot of reasons. Why does he not have toys of the other characters? How is this movie supposed to appeal to anyone, if I'm being honest? It was not good in my opinion. And it bombed. And I just don't care anymore about this movie. So let's get into my actual list. At number 10, Men. This was a movie that was written and directed by Alex Garland. He did movies like Ex Machina and Annihilation. And he was returning to A24, the studio that he did Ex Machina with. And he was doing a folk horror movie that was automatically on my list of like most anticipated movies. The trailers were eerie and creepy. And the movie is definitely both those things, but for all the wrong reasons. Rory Kinnear, I thought he was really creepy in the movie. Jessie Buckley was okay, but I feel like her character was just so thinly written that any actress could have played her, and it would not have made a difference whatsoever. And you'll know if you like this movie or hate this movie because of the last 10 minutes. The last 10 minutes are inexperience. That's all I'll say. It's just something that, it's a movie that I felt like tried to go too far, and it just didn't really understand anything. It just was ridiculous. It was over the top, and I've kind of seen this thing done better in other movies. At number 9, Violent Night. Now, this is a movie that I kind of heard like few things about it, but it wasn't until the trailer that dropped that I saw it and I'm like, oh, I gotta see this thing. This movie looks a lot of fun. It looks like action. It looks action-packed. David Harbour looks like he's killing it. You know, the two worst things this movie could do are take itself too seriously and show the best things in the trailer. Sadly, it does both those things. Even though David Harbour's really great, there are some creative kills. I really didn't care for the main family in this movie, aside from like a couple people. So, and again, a lot of the stuff that I saw in the trailers were just in the movie. And it's not as fun when you... Also, again, kind of like Men, where it's like, you'll know you'll like it in the end or not. You'll know if you'll like it in the beginning because of the first joke. And it just kind of just didn't work for me. I didn't really like the bodily functions joke. I don't mind blood, violence, profanity, or anything like that, but it's just anything involving a bodily function just makes me sick. So it kind of turned me off from the rest of the movie. And even though I have actually seen this again, and I don't hate it as much the second time, but it doesn't change the fact that that trailer was just so good. And I'm like, I don't love it as much as that trailer. Like, I would go back and watch that trailer, but I don't know if I could go back and watch that movie, though. At number 8, The Gray Man, a movie from the Russo brothers that had a whole bunch of people, including Chris Evans and Ryan Gosling in it. How could this movie go wrong? It's a movie that takes itself too seriously. The CGI is awful. Chris Evans is probably the best part in this movie, but it just wastes an incredible cast. Blew all this money on terrible visual effects and has an incredibly generic story that, again, a lot of the actors, aside from Chris Evans, they can't really just have fun with it. It's so boring, in my opinion. I kept forgetting that I put this movie on my, spoiler alert, it's on my worst of the year list, but I kept forgetting that I even saw this movie. It's that forgettable, in my opinion. At number 7, Studio 666. Now, you probably don't remember this movie. It came out in February, and it stars the Foo Fighters as themselves. They're in a haunted house, and all these things start happening. It looked simple enough, but it looked fun. I like Foo Fighters, so why not? And initially, I was going to review this movie, but when the weekend it came out, I think a snowstorm happened, so I just didn't see it. And then I waited a couple weeks. I think I saw it on the last day it was playing in theaters, and I think I was like the only person in the theater. And then I kept saying to myself, oh, I'm going to review this movie. And then sadly, Taylor Hawkins passed away. So I didn't want to talk about it then. So I saw this movie last day in theaters, and it wasn't good. The first 30 minutes of this movie, I thought were really good. I'm like, why do people hate this movie? This movie's fun. I'm laughing a lot. And then I saw the other hour of this movie, and I didn't like it. It wasn't scary. It was just confusing, and it kind of made me look at the band in a different way. Like, is this how Dave Grohl kind of sees himself? That was probably the only interesting thing about this movie. And I honestly felt sad afterwards. It was not as fun as I thought it should have been. It was over the top, but I felt like it was just so tonally inconsistent at times that I really couldn't recommend it as a comedy, as a horror movie. It just didn't work for me, unfortunately. At number 6, Amsterdam. David O. Russell, the director of movies like Silver Linings Playbook, The Fighter, American Hustle. How could he go wrong? And with a cast with people like Christian Bale, Margot Robbie, John David Washington, Rami Malek, Anya Taylor-Joy, Zoe Saldana, Chris Rock, Mike Myers, Michael Shannon, Taylor Swift, Robert De Niro. So many people are in this movie, and hardly any of them have anything to do. The idea of the movie is interesting, and I do agree with the message, but I just feel like the whole movie itself just wasn't totally consistent enough. It was way too long, and Amsterdam hardly has anything to do with the movie, actually. It was a mess. It was just a messy movie that honestly felt like a parody of a David O. Russell movie rather than an actual David O. Russell movie. So that didn't work for me. And number 5, 3,000 Years of Longing. This was a movie I was really looking forward to because George Miller directed the Mad Max movies, and this was his first movie since Fury Road. The trailers were interesting enough. Tilda Swinton finds a djinn played by Idris Elba, and she decides to make a few wishes. Could be a really interesting movie. The problem is, after the first hour of this movie, it becomes boring. Like, a lot of stuff with Tilda Swinton is kind of there, and it just doesn't really work for me in retrospect. The stuff with Idris Elba is pretty interesting for the most part, but a lot of the movie is just them talking in a room, and I just felt disappointed by that. And also, a lot of people were like, oh, well, this movie's really trippy, and it's really fun. It's not as trippy as I thought it would be. I would have preferred if this movie was really trippy, but it just wasn't, unfortunately. At number 4, and while we're at number 3, because they're 2 movies in the same universe, so I'm just kind of go back and forth with this one. At number 4, I'm going to put Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. I was really looking forward to this movie for a few reasons. Sam Raimi, he's returning to direct a movie, not just a superhero movie, but a horror movie at the same time. And Doctor Strange is a movie that I'm not a big fan of, but I do like Doctor Strange as a character, so I kind of wanted to see more of him. And unfortunately, I felt like this movie was kind of just a mess. I didn't like what they did with Wanda. I didn't really like what they did with America Chavez. Even though the actors do a fine job, felt like we didn't really get enough multiverse stuff in this movie. And again, there are some interesting angles and some interesting things I kind of want to see in the near future, but I felt like the movie was just a mess overall. And if you really want to see a really good multiverse movie, just watch Everything Everywhere All at Once. I cannot recommend that movie more enough. And while we're at it, number 3 is Thor: Love and Thunder. Again, I was actually looking forward to this movie because Taika Waititi directed probably the best Thor movie with Thor Ragnarok. So you have Christian Bale in this movie as the villain. You also have Natalie Portman returning in this movie. And she was returning as Mighty Thor in this movie. How wrong can this movie go? Shockingly wrong. So wrong in so many ways. The humor falls flat. The storylines are just kind of iffy. Every time they do a dark scene, they have to follow up with a light scene. It just doesn't work. Visually, it's impressive, but I kind of just didn't care as much as any other, well, not necessarily any other Thor movie, but this is the second worst Thor movie, but mostly by default. I could watch this movie and go, this is fun, but I don't know if I can just really sit and watch this movie ever again. I was just disappointed in Christian Bale. I was disappointed in Natalie Portman. I was disappointed in Tessa Thompson. I was disappointed in Taika Waititi. I was disappointed in a lot of people in this movie. It just didn't work for me, unfortunately. At number 2, Don't Worry, Darling. You should worry because this movie's on this list, and it's high on this list. This movie looked interesting. It was a movie that was going bigger than Olivia Wilde's previous movie, Booksmart, and a pretty solid cast with Florence Pugh and Chris Pine in it. And then all this drama kind of got into the way of the movie, and the movie itself doesn't really help it. The movie is bland, it's just repetitive, and then when you get to the third act twist, oh my god, the third act twist in this movie. The third act twist in this movie is just awful. It makes zero sense when you really think about it. On top of that, Harry Styles is just awful in this movie. The movie just ends, and I hated the ending of this movie. I've never seen a movie fall so far from being okay and kind of intriguing to just bad. I didn't like Don't Worry, Darling. Florence Pugh saves the movie. Chris Pine does a really good job, but this was just a movie that tried so hard, and it just flopped. It should have been a TV show. I feel like you could have explored a lot more with the TV show, but it wanted to be a movie, and this is what we got. It was just bad. But my number one most disappointing movie of 2022 was Babylon. Damien Chazelle has made 3 really good movies, and then he made Babylon, a movie that is 3 hours long. It's kind of chaotic and it just didn't really work for me. It just couldn't pick a storyline to develop, and only like a couple of the storylines are truly developed. The main character is not interesting enough, and I just didn't care for it. I was shocked that I just didn't care for it. Anytime the movie did a joke, it was just not funny. There's a lot of bodily function jokes, especially in the beginning, and I almost wanted to walk out because like I don't think I can deal with this. And it's love letter to the movies. It's barely a love letter. It's just, oh, I guess this is a love letter, so it just didn't work for me. Oh man, even though there are some good performances, mainly from Margot Robbie, Brad Pitt, and Jean Smart, and Lee Jun Lee, and also there are a few good sequences like the first 30 minutes, a couple sequences when they were filming. It just didn't work for me as a whole. I just felt like you could have cut out a lot of this movie and it would have been a lot better. But again, just because you're going bigger doesn't mean you're going to be better. And, you know, I just feel bad because this movie could have been something great, and it just wound up being a disaster. A box office disaster, a movie disaster. It was just bad. Oh man, I really didn't like Babylon. You can watch my video to kind of see why I didn't like it, but it doesn't change the fact that it was my biggest disappointment of 2022. So, what were your biggest disappointments of 2022? Comment down below, subscribe to the channel. This is Pat. Stay safe.